Welcome, everyone. I'm James Shore, and this is the Art of Agile Development Book Club. Today, we're discussing building software for operation, and I'm very pleased to have Jessica Kerr joining us as our special guest. Jessica Kerr is a software developer, speaker, and symmathecist, a participant in a system where people, tools, and software all learn from each other. She works to maximize the flow of learning within such systems and between those systems and their environments. Jessica works on observability at Honeycomb, teaching code to teach us what's happening. Jessica, welcome.
Thank you.
I'm going to get things started by reading an excerpt from The Art of Agile Development. As a reminder, the second edition is out now in both ebook and print editions, and the second edition is a 100% rewrite. You can get it from Amazon by visiting jamesshore.com/s/buy-AOAD2, and you can find excerpts and bonus material by visiting jamesshore.com/s/AOAD2. Chapter 15, DevOps. When I first started programming, my job was clear: build software and hand it off for release. After the handoff, a mysterious process would get the software into the hands of customers. First, it involved shipping CDs. Later, it involved a distant department called operations that seemed obsessed with bird calls. Awk, grab, burl. Either way, it was no concern of mine. This continued even after I started practicing Agile. Although Agile teams are meant to be cross-functional, operations were handled by other people I never met and rarely even knew the names of. I knew this wasn't in the spirit of Agile, but the companies I worked with had strong walls between development and operations, and secretly, I was glad. Fortunately, others in the Agile community weren't so complacent. They worked to break down the walls between development and operations, and later, the walls separating security as well. The movement came to be known as DevOps. It's also called DevSecOps. By breaking down the walls between development, operations, and security, DevOps allows your team to create software that's safer, more reliable, and easier to manage in production. And that is the topic of today's book club session. So let's go ahead and get started with our first discussion prompt. I mentioned in the opening that I talked about DevOps, and DevOps is one of those words I think that has gotten a lot of different perspectives over the years. So Jessica, what does DevOps mean to you?
I think it's about having the feedback loop of how your software is behaving in production, about recognizing that our software is useless unless it's running in production. You can have all the code in the world and it is inventory, it is costing you stuff until it's running in production, providing value to people. And DevOps closes that loop.
Yeah, I love that. And the comment you made about it being inventory, that it's, and for those of you who aren't familiar with lean manufacturing, inventory isn't a good thing. It's something that takes up space and time and energy until it actually gets out into the world.
And capital.
Yeah.
And requires maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I saw a talk from you, Jessica, I think it was in 2019 at Deliver Agile, where you talked about Samantha C. And in your bio, you talk about Samantha C as well. And if you all haven't seen this, it's just this fantastic idea that we are learning from each other and our systems and the systems that we create. So can you tell us a little bit about that and how it ties into this idea of DevOps?
Yes. So symmathecist is a word coined by Nora Bateson, who's an anthropologist and systems thinker. And she's like, we talk about systems all the time, but the word isn't good enough because it implies something that could be mechanical. Whereas when you look at an ecosystem or any team of people or family or community, it's you can't figure it out, even if you knew everything about it, because every part of the system is constantly learning. And as a result, the system as a whole is learning because a lot of that learning takes place in our interrelations. I think every team is a symmathecist, but software teams especially, because the software itself is participating in that. It learns from us because we change it, and we learn from it when it throws exceptions, or we learn from it really well when we have observability, when the running software is telling us about what's going on. And then we learn more and we learn about the business, and then we put that into the software, and the value of the software increases as it can do more. It's a symmathecist, and the word puts the emphasis on the learning because the system grows not through adding people, but through increasing the flows of learning.
Yeah, yeah. To join the conversation, raise your hand in Zoom, and we'd love to hear from you. Now, you're talking about DevOps and these learning systems where we're learning from each other and teaching the software how to teach us. How is that different than what you see out in the wild? Do you work with a lot of different teams? I know you work at Honeycomb, working on observability. Does that involve going out and talking to a lot of teams?
I get to talk to teams, and they're at various stages of this. It's like, where are you on product ownership? Where are you on continuous deployment? And the future is not evenly distributed, but that's the point. We're all continually learning and moving. And in larger companies, it varies within the company, but there's often many obstacles to that loop of everything that has to happen for us to be successful, by which I mean provide value to customers. So there's a lot of variation, and that's part of the problem. I mean, we can't speak to everyone where they are, and wherever you are is okay. May not be great, but it's okay if you're moving at all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what is your company like? Do you have this idea of DevOps? Do you teach the software how to teach you? Raise your hand in Zoom and let us know. So Jessica, operations and security are often treated as an afterthought. And well, I don't know if it's often, but I've definitely seen it treated as an afterthought. So why, and it takes effort to involve operations and security from the beginning, especially in companies where they're used to thinking of operations as a separate team.
Right. In a small company, in a startup, you can't help it. Mm-hmm. There's only these people, and they're going to do all the things.
Right.
But in large companies that have a separation, it's harder than it would be doing it by yourself.
Yeah. Which is kind of ironic. I work with a lot of startups, and they get to a point where they say it's time for us to act like, a real company. And
it's like, no, don't.
Yeah, they throw away all that great collaboration. And some of that, I think, just happens naturally because as you get bigger, those relationships that were very tightly formed in the beginning, you get distance between people just because there's so many new folks kind of bringing their own perspectives and diluting the conversation. So what are the benefits of treating operability and security as a first-class citizen from the beginning?
I think the biggest one is the holy grail of software, which is code we can continue to change safely. As we get bigger, software naturally ossifies, and it gets harder and harder to change. The people who understand it, who have that learning connection with it, and that mental model in their heads, they move on, they leave. How do we keep the ability to change and grow our software? And that is to keep changing it, even if it's little stuff like upgrading libraries. And I think that dynamic loop stays with us longer if we can do DevOps in the sense of, I'm aware of what my software is doing in production. When it has a problem, I find out about it and I can change it. I can do something about it. That's operations by themselves. They're so limited in what they can do about it. They can't add instrumentation to give themselves more information, and the developers can. So keeping that responsibility with the accountability, whatever.
It's early. I understand.
Yeah, being asked to do something and having the ability to do something about it, keeping those things together, keeps our software fluid, and then we can change, and then the whole business can learn.
Again, to participate, raise your hand in Zoom. Paul has a comment. Paul, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I guess as we do this digital like anthropology or archaeology, where I just have a question, like where do you think the origin of DevOps, like where did that word come from? Has anybody here traced it back? Yeah, out of curiosity.
It's in the book, right? Yeah, you said Patrick Dubois made the first use of it in 2006 when he started DevOps Days. I forgot where. I read that section
I don't remember
yesterday.
where it was either. I think it might have been in Europe, actually.
Yeah. And sort of as we go further, my natural read of it is like we're trying to bring development and operations together. And can you speak more to how that togetherness, like how do you see that? How do they, is there?
Yeah. So what does that look like in practice?
Yeah.
In practice, it looks like the people who write the code decide when to deploy it. It's really the decisions that need to come together to get that feedback loop. It does not require all of the knowledge of Kubernetes and the network stack and everything that operations people know. It's about the decisions. And that's why sometimes there are DevOps teams. As much as DevOps teams, really, people use that term for a platform team, which builds infrastructure abstractions that lets the decisions for deployment and scaling up and various other software-related choices, keeps those decisions in the hands of the development team while abstracting away some of the underlying knowledge and being a resource for when the team does need that knowledge, they know who to call.
Mm-hmm. So how much knowledge about ops needs to be in a development team to be a successful Samantha, to be a successful DevOps organization?
More than none. I really like Kubernetes because it is an abstraction over all this. It's like it defines concepts that are necessary. You have to define a network interface and blah, 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 blah. The nodes and the storage and then in AWS, you've got to define all the permissions for all of these things. It's useful to have done that because you at least get like kind of a laundry list of what operations is thinking about without having to know all the details. A good abstraction forces you to make the decisions that need to be yours, like how often to retry and what the timeout is. No, you can't just not specify a timeout. That's not how the world works. It forces you to deal with reality, but only those decisions that are necessary for reality and not a lot of underlying wiring and incidental stuff in the API. So you need to understand the concepts and be able to have a conversation with the operations team. And if you have a good operations team, that's enough.
Again, to join the conversation, just raise your hand in Zoom. I'd like to invite Irving up. Irving, welcome to the show.
Yeah, I was saying I work at PagerDuty. We're one of the relatively early proponents of DevOps. And for me, as somebody who's writing code, I don't work on the team that's building operations abstractions. I work on the teams that are writing the code that serves the customer need. A lot of it comes down to really having a personal relationship with what's going on in prod right now. And that's where, the tooling comes into place. If you've ever dealt with a mechanic who listens to your car for a minute and says, oh, I think it's such and such, because they have such a close knowledge of the way the machine works that they can hear something that's a little off. And so for me, a lot of what DevOps feels like when you're doing it well, just that being in tune and that, you have good tooling, so you don't have to worry about the stuff you don't need to worry about, but you have a sense of how it's going kind of all the time, and you almost have a gut feel when something's not quite right. And then you can go investigate and you can fix it because you're empowered to deploy what you need to deploy You have, in an agile development sense, you have the tests and the structure around you that let you confidently make changes to your code, even though, if you do something wrong, it's going to blow the customer up in about 10 minutes because you hit deploy and it's going out the pipeline. In a sense, it's almost the agile principles writ very large because it's taking it all the way out to the far end of production in terms of tightening the feedback loop and empowering the programmer, but also bringing with it the principles and practices that make that a safe thing to do.
That's one of the things that really struck me about DevOps in the beginning, Irving, was that it was sort of a sense of obviousness. Oh, of course, this is sort of the natural extension of what Agile is meant to be. But I don't often see it, unfortunately. But I do. Somebody in the chat mentioned that they really like that language of tuning, and I really like that too. What's your take on it, Jessica?
Oh, I think it's beautiful, and I'm going to tweet it later if I can find your Twitter, Irving.
It's at Irving Reed. So
great.
Thanks for your comments.
Yeah, I like the focus on what DevOps feels like too. That you're sharing that experience. And at the beginning of Agile, the idea was to have the customer on the team, but there was like an assumption of internal business software. And then that turned into a customer representative, which is a product manager, which is, whereas in like software as a service, the closest we can get to the customer is the production software. And we can get with observability, the idea is to get the production software to tell us what's going on with that user. And that feeling of being in tune. I mean, some people can do this with logs, with the system that they understand. They can just look at the logs go by and notice whether they're right or not. With observability, we do that with graphs. But one thing I love about Honeycomb is that we don't believe in AI. We believe in augmented human cognition. And people are really good at looking at those graphs and saying, that looks weird. And so then we give them ways to zoom in on that.
Mm-hmm. I'm really happy to hear you say that, because artificial intelligence seems to be a way of filtering out the stuff that the computer thinks isn't important, but it really doesn't know.
All it can know is the past. Yeah. Artificial intelligence is useful when you don't want anything to change. And I want my software to change and get better all the time. And I know the outside world is changing and different. And I don't want to hold everything the same. So AI is not helping me.
I want to talk about observability a little bit more in a moment. But before we get to that, you'd mentioned at these big companies that there's people are in different stages of a journey, which was a very polite way of putting it. So what would you recommend, as you see these people on various stages of the journey, what are some steps forward that these larger companies that have put up walls between operations and development, what are some steps that they could take on that journey?
Okay. I mean, there's a lot of where are you in the company and how much power do you have? One option at a higher level is to give developers the option of using internal operations or doing it themselves on AWS or given cloud. Because if your ops team, if their work is optional for you to use, then they have to make you want to use it. And then, of course, you have to give the ops people the abilities that they need to make it usable.
So that's an interesting take on it. I hadn't considered before, sort of setting up rather than you must go through the operations team in order to get your work done. You have a choice of going through the operations team, and that sort of pushes everybody to be better. Because of course, developers don't want, well, I suppose some do, but I would much prefer to have a nice platform to work with rather than going directly to these cloud systems myself.
But when you give people the choice of using the internal stuff or not, they use the external stuff, they're still going to have to worry about security and stuff like that, but they have to worry about it themselves. But then you set a floor on how hard can it be to get something done here. And that floor is how hard is it out in the world? And that way, in your company, you can only make it better you can only make it easier for people in your company, developers in your company, to get things done than if they did not have the resources of your company. Instead of inside many companies, it's harder to do something internally than it would be without the resources of the company.
We had Kent Beck on the show a couple of weeks ago, just 2 weeks ago now. And the recording's up on jamesshore.com for those of you who might be interested. And he talked about evolutionary architecture as part of his conversation. And something you just said reminded me of that. What he said was that at Facebook, where he worked for 6 years, rather than having architecture be, we're going to build something and everybody has to wait and then use the perfect thing we build, people are going to go out and they're going to go build their own thing, and we're going to use that to figure out which one is the one that actually works best. And the particular point he was making is, don't get in the way of the teams making progress.
Right,
and that's what I hear you saying.
Yeah. Yeah. One way to get operations out of the way is to not require people to go through them. Don't make it blocking.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as something is optional instead of blocking, then it has the opportunity to get helpful. But of course, that takes a lot of power in the organization to give people that kind of permission.
Yeah. Yeah. And that, of course, is something that has come up over and over in this show, because we can talk until we're blue in the face about this is the best way to do it. But,
we work where we work.
Yeah.
And the political situation is a real situation. This is the state of the system we're in. And that system, what is it? The system is what the system does. I don't really get that, but that's what people say. It has value, and we don't throw it away. We don't burn it all down. So the only thing that I've found useful as someone without that kind of authority is to get to know people in operations. Mm-hmm. You can fill out the form and then call somebody and ask them to really do something about it.
Again, to join the conversation, raise your hand in Zoom. Jono, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Welcome to the show.
Most people don't. Thanks for trying and getting it right. I was just reflecting on this, and to me, it just sounds like, well, I don't know. I mean, we have this taxonomy like DevOps and Agile, and it's kind of been co-opted, I feel like, in the industry of, like, instead of systems and principles, we move to checkboxes and tools, or maybe actions or things like that.
That's how you know a word was successful, when it's been co-opted.
but it's such a positive way of looking at it. I have a different phrase for it, but I won't say it. I can't say it on the show.
But I mean, it's one of these things where you go to an Agile conference, which I do, and then there's no developers there, and you're like, oh, we've lost, right? And so I kind of just wonder if, like, I'm starting to think, and tell me if I'm crazy, but, like, I'm starting to feel like general taxonomy, even though it's meant to like an abstraction, like DevOps or Agile, it's an abstraction of a bunch of principles, and I'm wondering if those are actually, like, anti-patterns now, because co-opting is such a common thing. Like, can't we decompose these things into principles and constraints, and maybe just talk about those so that we have a bit more clarity? And maybe there's just a lot of naivety on my part that won't also be co-opted. But
like, don't use the words, use the whole sentence.
Well, like let's not talk about Agile. Let's not talk about Agile anymore. Let's talk about, what feedback loops do we have on the customer and the customer's problems, or things like that. Like, I'm just, yeah, I'll shut up.
Yeah. For instance, we're talking about DevOps as developers knowing what's going on in production. There's a whole other side of that, which is, what did DevOps bring to ops, which is configuration as code, which is infrastructure as code, and automation. And you're right, we could be more specific about what we're talking about by saying the specific principle we're talking about. And this is a thing that happens with language. Different groups mean different things when they say a word. And sadly, most even of them, the individuals, are actually talking about different things, or a word has 6 meanings and you get to pick. And the ambiguity of language is super useful in humans, because it lets you and I talk to each other And maybe we're not actually talking about the same thing, but we can feel that we are and we can make progress. We don't have to get to that mathematical level of precision. Math is the only place you get precision. But then at times it's really helpful to be more precise and actually talk about the same thing. Domain-driven design is all about that. When do we need to get precise about our language? And then let's make definitions. Those only apply locally. You don't get to decide what a word means in the world. But as a group, you can choose to decide exactly what you mean by a word.
Thanks very much for your comment, Jono. I want to change direction here. I know you do a lot of work at Honeycomb, Jessica, in the area of observability. And when I asked you at the beginning what DevOps meant, you said it's about the feedback loop. I hope I'm remembering that correctly.
Yeah.
And I really love that phrase. It's, in extreme programming, that's how I came into the Agile world. And I still have a really soft spot in my heart for extreme programming. Feedback was one of the fundamental values of XP. And as I get older and further on my journey, I've come to realize how important that feedback loop is. The tighter the feedback loop, the sooner we get feedback, the more actionable that feedback is.
And the more fun it is.
Yeah. Then the more successful we are. So let's talk about observability. What does it mean for software to be observable? How do you get that sort of code whispering, automatic knowledge? You look at the logs and all you see is blonde, brunette, redhead. And and it's just all right there. What is that? How do you do that? What does that look like?
Okay, that's an excellent question because the word observability has been co-opted.
So it's successful.
Right, exactly. It has been co-opted from Charity Majors, our CTO, who brought it into the software domain. What we mean by observability is that your software tells you what's going on. It emits events. Logs technically are events. They're just unstructured, decoupled, little piles of human readable bits. So logs are degenerate events. And those events, you can both find out what's happening in context, usually in a distributed trace, which is like logs but put together in a structure that you can see. And you can find where you need to go from a high level. So metrics typically show you graphs of what's going on at a high level, how many things are happening at any given time. And you can alert on those. You can be like, everything just got way slower, and I should look at it. But so that's part of it. You have graphs at a high level. You have distributed traces at a low level, so you can really follow a customer experience, and you have a path between them. And most tools that call themselves observability can give you metrics. They can give you logs in some form of traces. But the path between them is really hard. And that's where Honeycomb is extra strong because we use the same data source for both of those. So you can click on a graph and get to a trace. You can say, how slow is this span usually? And get to a graph. The goal being you can understand the customer experience at an aggregate and individual level.
So what does the development team do, or what should they be thinking about or looking at when they think about how we're going to contribute to making the software observable? Because I assume it can't all be done automatically.
No, but the automatic ones are a great place to start. So like everything, good observability is an iterative process. So you can start with the auto instrumentation libraries. There's a standard for this now. It's called Open Telemetry. And there's auto instrumentation libraries for all the major frameworks and some obscure ones that plug in. And it's like, okay, you're going to need to know when an HTTP request comes in or goes out. You're going to need to know when we make a database call or a call to Redis or pretty much anything on the network. And so it starts by constructing those traces. A call came in from a customer, and then it went to this service, and then it called this service, and that one went to this database and ran this query. Typically not with the query parameters because that might be sensitive data, but the query itself with question marks in it is usually safe. So you start with that, and then you add attributes. So instead of spamming with logs, you can add a lot of attributes to the existing span. Now, this is dangerous in a lot of tools. So I'm speaking from a Honeycomb perspective where adding attributes is free. If you're counting metrics in a time series, that is not free. So don't treat it the same way. But you can add an attribute. Start with putting customer ID on the top span of the request so that you can tell whose experience you're looking at. And then as you go, you might find important units of work that are taking a long time, and you'll put a special span around those so you can see how long they're taking and what's executing concurrently. It's another thing that's really useful. But mostly add attributes to span instead of logs. And then you get the same information, but you get it in the context of what other state is going on and where you are in the processing of a whole request. But you wind up, gosh, I wish I knew this thing. I wish I had the value of this parameter by itself so that I could graph this number. Then you go and you add a line of code and you put it in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I imagine if you're using something like continuous deployment, where you have the ability to make a change and deploy right away.
A ton.
Yeah. What about now? You're talking about this from a Honeycomb perspective, which is, of course, a set of tooling around observability that is, I think, more sophisticated than what I typically see out in the world. So maybe the question I'm about to ask doesn't apply in your situation, but what about alert fatigue and
oh my gosh, I have a whole thing about alert fatigue because I work at Honeycomb and we have a solution to this.
Please share.
It is important. And it gets back to that. If you're being asked to do something, if you're being asked to wake up and respond to this beeping pager or whatever, you need the ability to do something about that. And maybe that something is fixing something in the system that maybe it's actually useful, or maybe that ability is to stop the beeping.
I love that one. We need to clip that one and just put it out there.
So at Honeycomb, we have service level objectives, and our service level objectives are event based. So you can do a different kind of counting, and you can look at the rate of errors. How much faster are things failing, or how much more frequently are they failing? How much slower are things running? How many events are okay and how many are not? And you can be like, oh gosh, it's the failure rate's gone up a bit. At this rate, we'll burn through our error budget in 3 days. Okay, page someone in the morning if it's a weekday. At this rate, we'll burn through our error budget in an hour. Page somebody right now. So you can have different severities, different urgencies. That's it, of alerts, because it's actually looking at what's your error budget and how fast are you burning it, mm-hmm. which is really useful.
I really like that approach of what's our error budget and mm-hmm. When are we going to run out, and then from that we can make a prediction, a forecast of when this needs to really need a lot of attention.
Yeah, because you're not aiming for 100%. You're not aiming for no failures. That's not a thing. And as you get asymptotically closer to it, it gets way more expensive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We're getting short on time, but I wanted to ask, sort of change the subject a little bit. Maybe changing the subject, maybe not. But we've talked a lot about operability. We haven't talked much about security yet. And so how does that tie in? And what are some of the common mistakes you see people making around both operability and security?
Oh, yeah. Operability, you can give people that feedback loop and they can experience how operable is it? What is the operator interface to this software, which includes observability? But security, that they don't. The most security problems are never exploited because there's so many. So that's a lot harder. I think security aligns really well with domain-driven design. So the top 2 things you can do for security are, number 1, upgrade your libraries. So for that, continuous deployment, automation. you can get notifications that your library's out of date. There's a lot of tooling out there for that now, because most of your code is other people's code. And then for your code, the number 2 thing you can do for security is really understand your data and know what values make sense in this field. And then you can validate it, and you can know whether it's safe to print to the logs, or send in your events or whatever. And to think about security, you need Slack. It's so opposite of what we mostly do as developers, because as developers, we're focused on what the software should do. And as security, we're supposed to think about everything else that it shouldn't do. And how do we make sure it doesn't do that?
Mm-hmm.
You know, they don't list that on the requirements.
Yeah. And it really takes a different kind of mindset. Sort of, this is something I imagine that people with a really good at QA, that mindset of what can go wrong would be beneficial. Have you ever worked, I didn't ask you this beforehand, so I apologize if I'm putting you on the spot, but have you ever worked with a third party, penetration testing firm or anything like that?
Only very, very, very indirectly.
Yeah.
At Honeycomb, we have a bug bounty. I'm glad I don't have to deal with administering that, because it's a pain. But I've seen like reports back from a third party pen testing firm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've only the only experience I have with it, unfortunately, is through automated tests, and those have sort of mixed utility, because in the chat, there's been a lot of conversation in the chat. For those of you watching the video, unfortunately, it's tears in the rain. But I was talking about automated security scans, and there was a comment in the chat about some feedback loops being too fast. And I don't know about too fast, but I do know that sometimes these automated scans are just too noisy. If you tell if you tell somebody that everything's broken, then how do you find the real?
Same with those noisy alerts. Yeah. What is important. A human is a lot better at discerning.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But there's a new version of this library out. Okay, you can tell me about that, and I'll click OK, upgrade it.
Yeah, and there's of course various vendors like SNCC for Node, SNYK. I don't know if I'm pronouncing their name the way they pronounce it. That will tell you when a library has had a security vulnerability discovered.
Yeah. Which, what are you going to do about it? Just keep it upgraded, people. And although there are dangers to that on NPM. Dependency management is so hard. But yeah, security is different. You have to give people slack to think about what can happen. You have to switch into a different mode to do threat modeling and stuff, and to write negative tests. I'm obsessed with error handling because that affects the customer experience so much. And what are we going to do when this happens, and this and this and this? At some point, you have to be like, not defined.
Yeah.
How about it's not defined in that case?
I would certainly agree with that. I think one of the things that separates a more junior developer from a more experienced developer is not how they write the code that works, but how they write the code that handles stuff not working. If you look at one of my hobbies is reading postmortems, because it's so educational to learn what has gone wrong. And often it seems to be, I made a configuration and everything fell down for 3 days. But
and they're so worried about code changes.
But after that, the next thing is, this system returned a value and we didn't know how to handle it, and then it cascaded throughout the system.
Most like catastrophic failures happen on minor errors because you didn't test the error case. Mm-hmm. Because they're really hard to test.
Yeah.
How do you even duplicate that error?
And this is an area where I feel like test-driven development, not that that's the subject today, but this is an area where I think test-driven development has a lot of benefit, because when you're doing TDD, it gets you thinking in the really nitty-gritty perspective. You're thinking about every branch you're writing very carefully. And so that sort of inspires you to, at least for me, it inspires me to think about all the things that can go wrong as well as the things that can go right.
And yet you can't TDD the connections between systems, and that's where things go wrong.
That is a very good point. I would love to keep talking about this, but that is our time for today. Jessica, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, James, and thank you to everyone who participated.
Yeah. Jessica Kerr is a software developer, speaker, and symmathecist. She works on observability at Honeycomb. If you'd like to hear more from her, you can catch her at Agile and Beyond in 2 weeks. She'll be in Detroit keynoting about what game design, not gamification. What was that? What was it that you said about gamification, Jessica?
Gamification is garbage.
Yeah, that was it. Yeah. So she's going to be keynoting about what game design can teach us about designing teams, which sounds absolutely fascinating. I wish I was going to be in Detroit in 2 weeks. Speaking about what's coming up, next Friday, we're discussing stakeholder trust. That is a big topic that it is at the heart of many of the problems I see in organizations. The free reading is already up. You can find it at jamesshore.com/s/AOAD2 book club. And you can join the Discord conversation by visiting jamesshore.com/s/AOAD2 Discord. And be sure to mark your calendars for the following week, May 27th. Kelsey Hightower will be joining us to discuss continuous integration and deployment. That is it for today. Thanks for joining us, everyone, and I'll see you next week.